This week has been full of the news about the dispute between the UK government and the EU in regard to implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, there's been quite a lot of commentary about it this week, and I've not rushed in to comment. I've taken a few days to think a little bit about it, to compose my thoughts before providing some what I consider some analysis. So here's some of my thoughts about how to approach the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol and some of the fundamental problems surrounding the ability of the UK government to renegotiate that protocol. We'll start with the main protagonist here, that is Lord Frost. He is the key negotiator for the UK, the Brexit negotiator. I think I am safe in saying that the EU considers his actions to be very political. And what I mean by that is that when you are negotiating, you're almost like an independent person. You almost switch off the part that says, this is what I truly believe in type thing. Well, you've got to believe, obviously, what you're negotiating. But you've also got to maintain a certain distance, a certain aloofness from the issues. And part of that is if you get too much into it, then you blind yourself. And it's crucial to have the ability to look dispassionately in the issue and to see that the other side are making valid points. I think for me that's a long-winded way of saying that I don't think the EU believe Lord Frost is doing that. He is a passionate Brexiteer, and thus everything he sees is the Brexit must succeed, it must work, because we can make it work and we believe in it passionately, that sort of thing. So what that means is that when it comes to counter-arguments, you're probably not going to get very far. And that's the impression I get from the EU statement. And this has been throughout the entire negotiation process. So it's been a bit of a challenging. And I try to avoid getting too much into personalities in negotiations. I try to focus more on the issues because that's what you should do to run a successful negotiation. However, for something as high profile as Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's very hard to do that. And quite a lot of negotiations do swing upon the basis of personality, as well as the issues. So I'm going to try and touch upon both of that as I talk through this issue. Let's start by some of the recent statements made by Lord Frost. So he's given a series of speeches, and here are some direct quotes from him. So the UK does not want to sweep away the Northern Ireland Protocol, but the deal risks creating cold mistrust with the European Union. And then, of course, we've got the next sort of statement, which is some would like us to sweep all the existing arrangements away. That is not our position. So that's outwardly perhaps sounds encouraging. However, and there's various other statements, and I've only picked one, he'd issued a threat to the EU. And he has said it is very clear that the threshold for triggering Article 16 has been met. And there's no other way of looking at that statement. That is a threat made to the EU that we will do what we feel is necessary. Now what that means is that is a unilateral action. And it's a very serious escalation when you do something unilaterally in any agreement, because effectively you'll be judged as in breach of that agreement if the other side did not consent, did not agree with that action. Unless, of course, in that agreement you have made a very specific provision that says you're allowed to do that you're allowed to take unilateral action. And that's kind of what Article 16 does. It does allow for that. But there's quite a problem here because it's very hard to negotiate in good faith. If you say you want to cooperate, you say you want to try and reach a consensus on finding solutions. But then if you're just making threats and if you're just taking unilateral actions, that does not engender goodwill on the other side. And it has to be remembered that this has been a long and tortured process to get the withdrawal agreement agreed, including the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there's very much an element of negotiation fatigue. So if you're going to want to renegotiate any bit of it, you've really got to make a very good case. I think part of the problem that we're seeing here, and coming back to the personality bit, that Lord Frost is very much openly articulating all this in a political arena. So the short story is, he's playing politics. He's not actually solving a problem as far as the EU sees it. And that's problematic. And when you think that somebody is manipulating the situation to create emotive support, shall we say, rather than logical card hold looking at fact, then that does create cold mistrust, to use his word. So I find it a little bit paradoxical in a way. The Lord Frost is saying, oh, we don't want to trade mistrust, but he is the person creating mistrust. By his very behaviour, he is angering the EU. He is making them not trust him. They honestly seem to see him as a genuine threat to the agreement. And I don't mean a threat in a, to take advantage type thing. They see him as a serious threat to derail everything and to create a huge number of problems in the UK, in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, and in the EU itself. So let's have a look at some of the comments from the EU. And I picked some choice statements by the European Commission Vice President. I'm not even going to pronounce that name. And he doesn't, he says it bluntly, I think. He doesn't mince his words. The protocol is not the problem. On the contrary, it's the only solution we have. Failing to apply it will not make the problem disappear, but almost take away the tools to solve them. Now, I don't know if that is fully true, whether the protocol is the only solution. I don't think it is the only solution, in all honesty. There are others, but the other solutions are ones that Lord Frost certainly does not want to consider. For example, rejoining the single market, but not rejoining the EU. That's their solution. Just not a very palatable one. But one thing that is quite clear is that both sides signed an agreement binding under international law. That is clear. And what you can see here is the EU saying that agreement works. It's there. It was painful. It was a compromise. Not a dirty word. What do you do when you negotiate? You compromise. But what is happening is that the UK does not want to accept that compromise. And part of the problem that we can argue why the UK doesn't want to accept, well, there's two reasons why. One is the UK did not do its due diligence. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and by extension the Northern Ireland Protocol, have lots of problems. And they have lots of problems because the UK politicians and officials endorsing them simply rushed it through and didn't read the small print carefully. They didn't fully understand the consequences of what they were agreeing to. And you can't blame the EU for that, I'm afraid, because at the end of the day, if you don't read the document properly, you take the liability, you take the risk of the consequences. That is part of what the EU is saying. They negotiated in good faith, And just because the UK was incompetent, you can't come back and just renegotiate because you were too incompetent to understand what it is you agreed to in the first place. The other part of the problem, that the EU sees it, is that all these failures, all these problems occurring in Northern Ireland with Northern Ireland Protocol, because the UK government is failing to implement the protocol. Not that it can't be implemented, but the UK government hasn't put the resources into it, hasn't planned properly. In fact, pretty much gives the impression that they don't actually want to implement it right from the very beginning. Never mind that they tried and they haven't succeeded. They just don't want to do it. A false promise, if you might say. And perhaps this was inevitable. The Northern Ireland Protocol always did try to square what were completely fundamentally contradictory positions and scenarios. The red lines. You couldn't agree for Northern Ireland not to be part of the UK, but the UK couldn't agree to apply EU rules within UK territory. You just couldn't fundamentally square that away. It was very difficult. So rather than trying, the UK had just deliberately, if you like, made a botched job for the EU beliefs. And that has consequences when you come to the table and you want to renegotiate. Which is why I talk about the other statement from the Vice President. We will not agree to renegotiate. And this statement is correct. It is an international legal obligation. You must adhere to it. Now that is not a completely fair and acceptable. You can renegotiate. But the way that you go about to do that is important. So let's talk a little bit. What are the solutions? What is the potential way through this problem? Well, the first step, you've got to understand, adhere, or reframe the core principles. And Lord Frost talks about this in his speech. He talked about that there are fundamental principles about protecting the Good Friday Agreement, about respecting integrity and allowing trade to occur. These are key principles. And the EU Commission, rightly or wrongly, tend to pride themselves on sticking to their principles. So if you're going to turn up and say, well, you need to renegotiate a document, then you need to tackle the issue of the principles. You need to say that the principles are not being applied correctly, or actually there's unintended consequence to the principles. So you either need to say we need to better adhere to it, or you need to reframe it. Shift the other side's understanding of how the principles should work or should be applied. And you sort of see Lord Frost trying to do that in his speeches. But it is also not too difficult to look at that and read it between the lines and see it as very political messaging, not practical, logical messaging in a negotiation sense. And what I mean by that, the second point, is to define and articulate the problem. So any sort of big collaborative style negotiation, and I fully realise that one of the big issues for Brexit is that it was treated as an adversarial style negotiation, not a collaborative, which is a fundamental mistake made from the very beginning, which is why it always goes wrong and continues to go wrong at its core. But park that for the side. For now, you need to define the problem. So if I've negotiated something with a counterpart, and I've later on realised that actually this has gone wrong, the way to solve that is you come to the negotiation table, you call a meeting with the other side, and you do a lot of preparation. You clearly set out all the issues, all the evidence that you have as to why things have gone wrong. Turning up and saying, we don't like it, we don't think it is balanced, we don't think it is fair, and giving the impression that you didn't do your due diligence properly, doesn't tend to win the argument in that sort of scenario. That's not truly defining the problem. That is just saying, oh, we signed it, but we don't like it really, so we want to change the deal. Essentially what it's saying. And you're not going to get, especially for big, complicated, difficult negotiations that the EU exit definitely was, you're not going to get much headway if that's all your argument. So Lord Frost really needs to talk about the practicalities of the problem, the practicalities of moving goods and how that is not working. And he could possibly talk about the way that certain groups in Northern Ireland have had very strong reactions, and that itself could be a threat to one of the key principles, for example, the Good Friday Agreement that maintained peace. So obviously no one wants to undermine the Good Friday Agreement. That's the core principle. So you're reframing it. You're saying, how do we implement things in a way that doesn't undermine that principle? And I don't think he's done that very well, at least not openly. So what that means is, having clearly articulated those sorts of problems when you need to amend or renegotiate something, you then need to invite the other side to work with you in solving that problem. And key to that is, of course, in maintaining credibility. You must be seen as honest and truthful, and telling the other side all the issues, warts and all, including admitting to your failures, because that would be necessary. Oh, we didn't foresee that, we didn't realise, we're sorry. Anything like that goes a long way when you're doing a collaborative style negotiation, to making the other side understand that it is an unintended consequence. And this is a key thing about any kind of negotiation of this type. You should really both want the same thing. You should both want the deal to succeed. The other side should not want you failing to be able to adhere to the deal, because that creates failure for them as well. There's usually some form of mutual dependency. So part of the re-establishing credibility is you work with them and say, what can we do to address this failure? And there's all sorts of various ways of doing this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a renegotiation of Northern Ireland Protocol itself. There can be all sorts of subsidiary implementing agreements that can actually be worked on to address all these points of failure. But unfortunately, we're not seeing any of that. And in fact, even when I read what was proposed as the solutions, a large chunk of it don't even seem to be applicable to the protocol at all, or even Northern Ireland. They actually seem to be almost by the back door, attempting to renegotiate the trade and cooperation agreement itself. So the linkages between the problems in Northern Ireland Protocol and what the UK government was proposing as supposed solutions didn't look very clear cut. And so it is not too hard to see that the EU Commission would look upon all these statements, all the political type actions, all these proposals submitted by the UK government with cold mistrust. They don't feel there's a compelling case, and they feel there's just a political game being played here. And unfortunately, this is creating a scenario where only two things can really happen. One or the other of the side has to back down, or neither side back down, and this carries on all the way into being a fully acrimonious scenario. And what I mean by that is all the way into the courts. And that is not something to welcome. That is a complete breakdown in trust, a breakdown in relationship when you have to go down that route. And right now, it's hard to really argue against the EU's position, because they're very clearly stated, internationally binding agreement, they haven't seen anything that compels them to deviate. And like any kind of contract that you might agree, you stick to the terms of the contract and let the other side agrees to deviate. So if the EU doesn't agree to deviate, then the UK has to comply with those obligations. Now, Article 16, of course, is the complicating factor in that. But invoking Article 16, taking unilateral action, doesn't really, it may fix you in the short term. That is exactly how the UK government is doing it, is using it as a short-term fix, essentially to kick the can down the road, to postpone the problems, which have been a long time in coming and very much foreseeable by many people. But kicking the problem down the road doesn't really get anywhere. It just ends up in a very expensive, acrimonious day in court, really. So I would hope that behind the scenes things are better than they are politically. Let's hope that there's just political optics, and that really behind the scenes the officials, both the UK and the EU side, are trying to apply these principles, trying to solve the problem, articulate and solve the problem, and working together. But right now, I think all the noise in the media is not positive, has to be said. And whilst I would normally say I don't believe everything you read in the media, again here this is an argument that's being played out very publicly, and really another example of how not to do a negotiation, unfortunately. So I hope that helps explain this a little bit more clearly in a slightly different way to what you get from reading normal media reports. And if you've got any comments or suggestions, then please do put them in the comment section. They would be very much welcome.